So stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch where they make you crazy.
Everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of TRD Talks Live. I'm Eric Enquist, Senior Managing Editor at The Real Deal, and I'm happy to be joined today by three experts on mass transit. Nick Sifuentes, Executive Director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, Bob Previdi, who spent 14 years at New York City Transit as Director of New Technology, and Ben Kabak, who many of you know as the author of the transit blog, Second Avenue Sagas. But before we get to our panelists, just a reminder to all our listeners today, please go to therealdeal.com and subscribe. These are free, but we will not be able to keep bringing them to you if you do not subscribe. So please go to therealdeal.com and subscribe and listen to our TRD Talks for free every Monday and Wednesday at 5 o'clock. So welcome to all the panelists. We're here to talk about how to save the subways, which is a huge issue for our readership, because with no subways, there really is no real estate in New York City. So I want to start by getting your take on what do you think the level of crisis is for the subway system in New York, given COVID-19. Nick, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah, happy to start off. I think you can look at the crisis in one of two ways. If you want to talk about whether there's a medical crisis on the subways, i.e. how dangerous is it, I think we're not really at a crisis point at all. And I'll get into it and talk about why I think the MTA has already taken some good steps to harden the system against this kind of danger and what else it can do. But at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of transit agencies around the world are showing that transit is and can be safe, even in the middle of a pandemic, with the right steps. Now, on the funding side, I think there's a huge crisis. The MTA has hemorrhaged money because riders have left the system in droves for obvious reasons, and those riders are going to take a while to come back. That means massive shortfalls for the MTA on the operations side, just the money that they take in fares, but also in terms of tolls and taxes too. This all adds up to a tremendous crisis for the MTA's budget, and it's going to take federal leadership to get us out of it. And we know federal leadership is, shall we say, a little lacking at the moment. So in that regard, real crisis, yeah.
Ben, what's your take? Is the system going to survive? How bad is this?
I think it survives. We're not in danger of losing the subways. They're not going to shut it down. And at some point down the road, if the federal funds that Nick was talking about don't materialize, there'll be discussions about service cuts. There'll be discussions about fare hikes. But you're looking at such a large budget gap that the tools the MTA usually has at its disposal to cover its own budget problems aren't really available. You can't raise fares to cover a $10 billion 18-month budget gap and then expect people to still ride. You can't cut service to cover a $10 billion budget gap because the MTA doesn't really even provide $10 billion worth of transit service to cut. So ultimately, it's either going to be a situation where the MTA just takes on even more massive amounts of debt, or the federal government comes through and delivers the money they need.
But I think we're assuming here, and Bob, you correct me if I'm wrong, that this is a limited problem to get through. But do you really think we're ever going to get back to 5.5, 6 million riders a day? Or will we just need to permanently change the subsidy system to keep the system afloat?
I think we're going to have to figure out ways to change how people travel in the system. The same way people are trying to figure out and reinvent what work is going to be. I think the business community is going to have to work hand in hand with the MTA to start to figure out, well, what role will the MTA play and how will it play that role? And I don't think I've seen enough of that discussion going back and forth. It's been entertained, people have talked about it, but I'd like to see a bigger role by the business community to step up and say, all right, well, how could we energize people and get people back on these trains?
Well, Nick, let me go back to something you said, and this is really the crux of the matter, is whether the subways are dangerous or not, if there is any amount of crowding on the trains. And early on, there was a study that came out. I hate to even call it a study because it was so slapdash, but someone decided to overlay, confirmed COVID cases with the New York City subway map, call that science, and decide that the subways were a major source of coronavirus transfer. Do any of you buy that?
So
Nick,
I,
was
you know,
that, was that just, go
I've
ahead, Ben.
tried to read a lot about how this disease is transmitted and what the risks are as people get back onto transit. And one of the early studies that really fingered, not the MIT study that you're talking about, but one of the studies out of China that really fingered a bus ride as a source of spread, was about a 50-minute chartered bus ride, no stops, no ventilation. There wasn't an on or off. So it was much more of a traditional exposure model. We have seen, this isn't to say we don't know if it can spread on transit, but we haven't seen any studies that really pinpoint transit usage as a spreader event. Yes, workers have been at risk, and that's a separate issue. But in terms of riders, between the flow of passengers on and off, the fact that trains and buses can be ventilated, the fact that you're not on for a very long time, we haven't really seen numbers increase as cities have reopened their transit systems. We know that wearing masks on transit is very important, and we know that limiting talking on transit is very important as well, because you reduce the droplets and the aerosols. But again, a lot of cities that are very transit dependent have reopened their systems, haven't seen an increase in cases that arise out of transit. And I think there's this tension between the fact that people are assuming that enclosed spaces are bad because they are, and that's what leaders have been saying, but the fact that transit itself is a little bit different because it's not quite an enclosed space as your office may be.
I'm going to jump in and say, Ben, on the number 7 train, you've got an upstairs elevated system where it takes 30 minutes from Main Street Flushing to Times Square. And the amount of time that those riders are taking the train and the amount of ventilation on those elevated stations, I'm hard pressed to put the number 7 line in the crosshairs on this one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
by the same token, I think airplanes have pretty good circulation. Do you guys have a sense of how good the circulation is on subway trains? I mean, the air conditioning seems to work pretty much all the time now.
So I worked with a guy who was an expert in tunnel ventilation fans, and would talk to me about the piston actions of the trains and the amount of airflow that you would even get in the subway. And it was pretty impressive. So I think, there's certainly a lot here that has to be learned, but the kind of conditions that I'm hearing, that Ben's hearing, was also echoed by a woman today who I was listening to on a podcast. She was from Virginia Tech. And she was saying, you really need to be in a closed environment for an extended period of time. And I think, we need to get this studied. We need to get it studied quickly, and we need to build confidence. And I think we need to do that in combination with getting the information out to the public and just start hitting that image that people really want to get rid of, which is they really don't want to get on a packed train. And I think they're conflating issues and making this seem a lot worse than it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I would
Nick.
agree with that actually, and just say, I think ventilation is one of the key things that we need to get a handle on. There was a study that was done of an outbreak of coronavirus in a Guangzhou restaurant, and that found that ventilation, specifically the AC, was actually a big piece of the spread. One key finding from that, though, before everybody kind of panics and says, oh my goodness, AC is a source of spread, is that it actually had very, very poor ventilation. It was actually about 10 times lower than the average acceptable indoor air quality standard here in the United States. So in other words, this is to say, while it is the case that ventilation is a risk point, if you don't have good enough ventilation, but you have air circulation taking place, for the most part, most American systems of ventilation are actually fairly well equipped already. It is important for the MTA to very specifically study this on subways. On buses, there's a simple solution here. You open the windows. That actually does a lot, surprisingly, to really make sure that air is circulating well enough to get virus particles out of the immediate threat range for most people.
Right. Believe it or not, you can open the windows on subways as well. People rarely do, but depending on the odor that you may sense, once in a while I will do that myself. I'm wondering, how much rider behavior is going to be part of this, because some of the super spreading incidents have been choirs and people singing, which we get in the subways. We get a fair number of preachers. We get a fair number of people begging. And we get some singers, a good number of singers, and the acrobats, who, by the way, are still out there, from what I've read. So how important is that? Ben, do you think we can get rid of that once and for all?
I don't want to say that we should really have heavy-handed enforcement of anything in the subways these days. I think it's important to sort of educate the public as to what's okay and what isn't, and what kind of behavior we should be discouraging. I think that the best guidance that the MTA has given is that everybody should be wearing masks. And the couple of times over the last week that I've been on the subway, it's been pretty good. On Friday, I took the train for a couple stops for the first time since March, and the Friday crowd, everybody was wearing masks. A little less compliant on Saturdays, but still people were wearing their masks. And I think as more people get back to the system, that will become an important PSA. And like I said, no talking, no singing. It becomes tougher to really convince people who are doing this to stop. But I think a lot of the organized programs like the MTA Arts for Transit, which is the Music Under New York program, would probably have to take a pause. Preachers are always a problem. I mean, nobody likes those in good times. And now you have people sort of shouting and spreading droplets through the subway cars. And maybe there's some sort of public shaming and a PSA campaign behind that. I think it's tough to get people to change this type of behavior, but to make the system both be safe and feel safe, it's important.
The MTA actually just studied this. They looked at 5 days in late May to see what mask compliance looked like. And they found that across all the stations they looked at, they had 92% mask compliance. What's good about this is that the transit systems around the world that haven't actually seen any kind of COVID-19 outbreaks at all related to the transit system all have incredibly high mask compliance, well over 95%. Systems in Asia that were prepared for SARS or prepared after SARS, which happened in 2003, and you have high levels of mask compliance on the system at all times there. You haven't seen any outbreaks traced to the Tokyo system and other Asian systems. Recently, Vienna, Austria also put out requirements for high mask compliance, and they're seeing in the high 90s as well. And they haven't been able to trace a single outbreak back to their system either. So I think, the question of what does the rider behavior do here? Rider behavior is everything. The more that people comply with mask wearing, the more that people limit and don't talk at all while they're on the train, I think that's really what it comes down to. The interim head of New York City Transit, Sarah Feinberg, said social distancing was going to be very difficult or impossible on trains. And that's a true statement, but there's a lot that we can do to make sure that we're limiting any kind of transmission out of the mouth. And that's really going to be the key piece of this for every rider.
Right, I think, go ahead, Ben, but don't you think that the shaming also is not really about the preachers or the beggars, it's about the people who give the money, because that's the reason they're on the trains, because they're getting money out of it.
I think every chance that the MTA gets to whether talk about arts for transit or talk about crowding is going to be a chance to talk about the nuance of all of this. Arts for transit is fine if it's a guitar player on the platform, and they should say that. And they should say, we're not allowing singing because of the aerosols. And we also encourage you to not talk while you're in the subway. And every opportunity that they can get to reinforce what those messages are. We want to be nice to each other. We want to say good morning, but we really don't want you to talk while you're taking a subway ride. I remember back in the late 90s when we had an issue with dwell time reduction at Grand Central. And it was a comprehensive program. We reinforced it with platform conductors. We had car cards on the trains themselves. We put PSA ads out, and it really culminated in improving the dwell time at Grand Central. And then we permanently reinforced it with something on the station platform itself.
By the way, dwell time is the amount of time that the train spends next to the platform, right? Loading and unloading.
That's correct. I'm getting a little too technical here, but I think every opportunity that the MTA gets to talk about what the appropriate behaviors are by riders, I think is important. And they should also manage up. Cuomo's been fantastic, and they should have Cuomo might maybe model the behavior and keep talking about it as well. I think that's important.
Ben, a lot of what you write on your blog is about messaging, and typically you're not happy with it. Tell me what your thoughts are so far on the messaging from the mayor and the governor and others on. And
I think in terms of messaging, the governor's been much stronger than the mayor, and the MTA has really been taking the lead here. The mayor's messaging has been a little bit mixed, and in a negative way. He initially was very combative towards the MTA, saying you need to ensure social distancing. The MTA kept saying we'd like to, but that means that you can only fit 8% of people on the trains, and at no point during this crisis, even when only essential workers were riding the trains, were we really below about 10% of ridership. So there's still a lot of people using the trains, and 10% of ridership, while that's low for New York, it still makes it the busiest transit system in the country. So there's still a lot of people. And I think the mayor could be doing more on the bus side of things. I think we've all understood that buses can be a way to spread out commutes. You're not going to overload the subway system as much. The buses have been very popular. As Nick mentioned, they're naturally ventilated if you just crack open the windows. And if you really prioritize adding bus priority lanes in the city, so busways and bus lanes, and then getting the cars out of the way, you can provide people with other options that are faster and may not have the same concerns about crowding as the subways, and then also just spread people out, make them use a variety of different tools to get around the city. And whether that's making sure we have a better bike lane network than we have right now or more buses, it just helps to make sure that there aren't people flooding the subways to the same degree that we're used to.
Just to clarify, the MTA is a state authority.
Yes.
But the mayor has control over streets. So to the extent that buses need their own lane, that falls on the mayor, correct?
Yes. So the MTA has asked for more bus lanes than the mayor gave. The MTA asked for 60, but it's ultimately up to the mayor to decide how many miles they're going to give, and he's only given 20.
Did it bother you when he closed the beaches and said, the reason I'm closing the beaches is because it's dangerous to take the subways to get to the beach?
It bothered me because I don't think it's completely correct that it's dangerous to take the subway, and it never seemed to be. I understand why they're saying we don't want people on the subways because they should be for essential workers. But at the same time, it's hard to tell New Yorkers we're closing off this great outdoor space for the summer when, we understand it's safe to be outside. It's better to be outside. We need people to get outside. Instead of saying, look, we're going to make it easier for you to get to the beach if you live somewhat nearby. We're going to add a bus lane out to the beach in Brooklyn. We're going to give you a bike lane, take cars off one of these streets and make sure that people can get there safer. I think that would have been a better, more holistic approach. And it also avoids this messaging of making it sound as though the subways are very dangerous.
Yeah, Bob, you were director of innovation for the MTA, which for New York City Transit, which to me sounds like a contradiction in terms, because it is not an innovative historically agency. Not your fault because you haven't been there for a little while, but just in the last 20 years, I mean, can you think, how many innovations can you name that have come out? We're still using MetroCards that debuted in 1994.
It's been very painful to watch the adoption of new technology in the system. And to the agencies, it's difficult because the place is so big. But a lot of the innovations are slow to be adopted because there's just such resistance to change within that environment. It took far too long to get the next train signs, the countdown clocks working. I started that project in the mid '90s. Wow. And living in Philadelphia for 7 years before they actually turned it on, and so I couldn't even have it on my resume. But these innovations, you're going to see these innovations start to speed up, because one thing we haven't talked about yet, and I'm sure we will, is all right, we're moving 800,000 people a day as opposed to 5.5 million. What does ramping up look like? And the MTA has made a commitment. I know BART in California and WMATA have made commitments to publish daily ridership numbers. We're going to have to start to fine tune that. And then as we start to get more and more crowded, at what point are we going to want to have that discussion about the Lexington Avenue line, the Queens Boulevard line at 5 o'clock? And how, when we start to see more riders, how are we going to start to manage that information so that the public and business owners could start to take, I think, a proactive approach to trying not to have the trains so darn crowded? Because until we have a vaccine, until everybody's more comfortable, people are going to stay away. And that's going to hurt the MTA's budget if we don't have those riders. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But Bob, it's not just information, because I think most New Yorkers know when the trains are going to be crowded. They're going to be crowded at 8:30 in the morning. They're going to be crowded at 5:30 in the evening. I mean, what are some steps? I know you've thought about this a lot, but some simple steps that you could take to sort of push that, rush hour, spread it out a little bit.
The MTA, I mean, if they had their way and had a heck of a lot more cars, we could be running a lot more service everywhere all day. That's not practical. But could they have a second peak? They probably could have a second peak, probably at 11 a.m. And so imagine two kind of workday periods, 9 to 5 and 11 to 7. And that could start to spread out the peak enough that we could really avoid those kind of crush loads, which would be very, very interesting. But I think what we need, and the MTA I know has started it as part of their 13-point plan. They've talked to the New York City partnership about spreading out staggering work hours. But I think the business community, whether it's the New York partnership or the Real Estate Board of New York or other groups, I think they need to take that advice seriously and start to do surveys and start to talk to business leaders, major employers. What could we do? And the MTA could supply the data. Look, the data is looks like a bridge, with the AM peaks right now. How could we flatten those curves so that we could sustain more people during the course of the day in not as crowded situations?
Nick, Tri-State Transportation Campaign is coming out tomorrow with a bunch of recommendations. Do you have anything along those lines?
We do, yes. So we're putting out a report that has 55 recommendations for agencies, transit agencies, riders, businesses, and elected officials. And for businesses and elected officials, some of our biggest recommendations are being the voices here. The power of the bully pulpit is an incredibly potent one. And businesses need to basically be working in hand with local governments and with agencies to say, yes, we're going to do staggered work hours. We're going to encourage telecommuting. We're going to make sure that we have built-in plans as a business for what happens if an employee tests sick and how we manage the rest of the commuter flow of anybody around that person. All of these things are incredibly important. And then for elected officials, one of the primary recommendations we have is encouraging businesses to help make that shift, but also helping riders understand exactly what interventions riders themselves can take. And I think that that's also part of the critical piece here. One other thing that we're recommending for agencies is to partner up with micromobility companies as well to make sure that we can spread out people's commutes across all modes. So getting people off of subways and onto buses is good. What can we also do to spread people onto e-bikes and e-scooters to get more people using our bike lanes so that we don't have a massive crush of cars on day one of, say, phase 4 when everybody starts coming back to the office. One thing that we know about New York is we cannot put more cars on our streets and expect anybody to be able to move. Speeds in Midtown are down below 5 miles an hour. It's just not possible for us to cram more single occupancy vehicles on. So we've really got to make sure that we're taking advantage of all modes and that we're leveraging exactly what Bob is talking about. Businesses' flexibilities to stagger work hours and do telework so that we can spread out that flow throughout the day.
One of the reasons that we get crowding situations is when something goes wrong. I mean, the most crowded situations are when there's a sick passenger and the train sits in a station for 10 minutes. And then not only do you get crowding on trains, you get platform crowding. So do you think, Ben, do you have any hope expectation that we will see improvement in either clearing? I mean, they've talked about this for years. They just never seem to do much in getting sick passengers off trains or stopping the police from shutting down lines, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be the challenge. It's how do you plan for the unknown and how do you plan for the day-to-day disruptions that still happen? I mean, even though people aren't riding, you see the NYC Transit Twitter feed, they're still talking about these types of delays and sick passengers and everything along those lines. I think it's important for the MTA to continue with pilot programs that they had been developing to sort of short deploy response teams so that they were stationed throughout the system. And if there's an emergency and they need to get somebody off a train, you're not waiting for somebody to show up for 20 minutes. So you can hopefully get someone there faster. But those sorts of delays are sort of inevitable. You had switch problems. We know where those switch problems are. We know that they're not going to be fixed, and you're just sort of crossing your fingers and hope that they arise at 10:30 at night instead of at 5:30 in the afternoon when it's not going to create crowd conditions. You know, if these problems arise once we're back to even say 2.5 million riders per day, let alone 5, I think there needs to be some more flexibility in terms of getting people just back up onto the surface, getting them out of the system, seeing if there's a way to get buses moving a little bit faster. And again, as Nick was saying, it's really about making sure that you're prioritizing higher capacity modes of travel through the more crowded parts of the city.
What about the nightly shutdowns? I mean, is that a pilot project, or do you see that continuing where from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. That the trains simply don't run? And this was suggested before COVID even existed by, I think, Regional Plan Association came out and said you could take advantage of those hours to clean trains and do work on the tracks.
I don't think it's necessarily a problem to have the system shut down. You probably could have a skeleton system in place, and you could probably figure out probably the number 7 and Queens Boulevard line would stay operating all the time anyway, but there probably are some lines that could be easily substituted by buses. This is not an unusual thing. A lot of cities in Europe do it.
I think it's actually a huge problem. I think that New York prides and predicates itself on a 24-hour system. You know, we call ourselves the city that never sleeps for a reason. And so, you know, nightlife and entertainment rely on overnight service. But more than that, and now more than ever, we've seen how essential workers are using the system all the time, even in the middle of a pandemic. And many of those workers are third shift workers at warehouses and delivery locations. We've got people who are going to and from hospitals at those hours. I think it's untenable for us to have a subway system that shuts down. And I think that if you look at worldwide trends, I mean, London, even just in the last 7 years, has expanded their system's overnight capacity tremendously. I think it's vital that New York have a system that runs 24/7, and we need to get our ability to maintain the system in line with that expectation. We've been operating like this for a very long time. I don't see any reason to roll back now of all times.
And I would add to Nick's point, I think it's a different equation when you're really talking about 11,000 or so overnight passengers, as the MTA was saying they had during the last couple of months. And, you know, in a normal, when you have 5 million, 5.5 million, you're really still talking about 130,000 people that are using the subways between 1 and 5. And it's really hard to get that number of people around the city outside of the subways. I think there's some questions that the MTA hasn't answered particularly thoroughly as to whether or not they actually need to shut down the system to do the cleaning that they do, considering overnight headways and the fact that they have a lot of trains that they can move in and out of service. They could maintain some bare bones service and keep cleaning and make sure that the trains are clean and make sure that they're disinfected and ensure that people are satisfied with that response while still providing those connections. And then if we're going to have the conversation about a prolonged shutdown of overnight subway service, we need to make sure that the bus service that they're providing, the bustitution service, is actually sufficient and not just beefing up local bus routes where you're now asking people to make 3 transfers or 2 transfers, but actually mirroring subway routes, and they haven't done that yet.
And one other point I think that's very specific to COVID right now is, you know, the whole idea behind this 1 to 5 shutdown is for sanitization of the trains. The reality is that, you know, we're now learning that fomite spread, i.e. that contact spread, is not actually the main way that COVID-19 is being spread. You know, it's mostly respiratory. So everybody likes clean trains. I do too. But if you're asking the question, you know, is this now an existential service to prevent COVID at this point versus having the total overnight closure that we're dealing with? I think the answer is no. I think it's far more important to be dealing with the ventilation, the masking, and those kinds of respiratory spread concerns rather than the spread that people are worried about on surfaces.
Well, that gets to the whole divide between science and public relations, doesn't it? Because you have to think that, you know, 50% of this shutdown and the cleaning is just to give people confidence in the system. And, you know, 40%, I think, was to get homeless people off the trains. And, you know, the other 10% maybe actually reduce COVID. Do you think, I mean, when Cuomo went crazy about homeless people on the trains, that was the exact moment that they started cleaning them from 1 to 4. Was that a coincidence?
I think you're onto something there. But Ben hit the nail on the head. Most of the trains, the car capacity is in the yards in the evenings. And they absolutely could figure out how to do that. But the real reason the MTA jumps on this is something that they could do. This was something in their wheelhouse and that they are comfortable with. They are not comfortable with managing crowds. They've never been comfortable managing crowds. This is going to require a different type of understanding the flow of passengers, reading the situation, and as you were talking about earlier, where is there a sick passenger? Can I advise people to go a different way? It's a different. I've been there. I've done it. I've been live and on air trying to detour people to a different direction. But you've got to have a different skill set, understanding what is needed at rush hour versus what's needed during non-rush hour. What's the headwinds?
Are you talking about platform controllers? Because it seems
no, I don't think that's
no. They're doing actually,
no.
other than waving their flashlights.
No, I think the platform controllers are probably useful in a couple of key locations to really back up. No, in this day and age with technology that we've got available to us, we could be advising people immediately, as the MTA does, that there's a problem. But what they're not doing is giving advice as to, all right, well, you've told me what the situation is. Now what do I do? Should I stay? Should I wait 10 minutes? Should I try going a different direction? I know as a former spokesman, I used to go out on a limb and advise people, given the time of day it is, I would stay home for another 30 minutes, let this situation clear. Why? Well, we have 400 incidents a day. We know how many sick customers we're going to have on an average day. And if you tell me what time of day and where, I can tell you it's going to take 20 to 30 minutes to clear a sick customer. So why not have a script and let the announcers say what they think's going to happen? They don't do that. They're afraid. They're definitely afraid of letting the announcers have a more human answer to advise the customers about what their options are.
Who are these announcers? Where are you talking about? The people on the trains or in the station?
No, these are the people who are in the control center. You have announced. I mean, most of the time you hear the announcer on the train, the conductor on the train, but the rail control center knows exactly where every train is. As soon as the call comes in they know immediately what type of an incident it is. They have trouble codes. They know exactly what those trouble codes are. And you could come up with, well, how long is these incidents taking? And what time of day is this happening? We could become a lot more sophisticated in the information that we're providing the customer, and the agency doesn't do that.
I think, Eric, to get back to your question too, though, about the homelessness concerns, it helps to understand the overnight shutdown as sort of a long drawn out conclusion to something that the governor had been hammering for a while. He had really been pushing the MTA on addressing the issue of homeless New Yorkers living in the subways. I think it's unfair to foist that onto the MTA. The MTA is a transit agency. They're not a social services agency. They're not a housing agency. They're not a mental health organization. They have tried to engage people who are employed by the city to address homelessness. But again, if you listen to what the homeless residents are saying, they're saying they don't feel safe in the shelters. They know that the subways are clean and warm and keep running. And so they stay there. And I think at this point, it became a bit of a public health perception issue where New Yorkers were concerned that the presence of more homeless people on the trains when there weren't as many other riders was creating a public health problem. And the response from the governor was to say, well, then we're just going to kick everybody off the trains. I don't find that a particularly satisfying response. I think it shows a lack of problem solving, and it really pushes the fact that the city and state have failed to address homelessness at an overall level onto the MTA. And you're saying, well, this is how we're fixing the problem. And I think that's something they're going to have to grapple with when they bring back 24/7 service.
And I think to Ben's point, the MTA has been under this pressure to provide more services than it's actually set to provide. Another great example is the proposed hiring of 500 new MTA police officers, which has been frozen because of the budget shortfalls. But the only reason that was frozen was because of those budget shortfalls. I think it's pretty clear that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have the MTA in charge of doing more than the thing that it is supposed to do, which is the provision of subway and bus service and commuter rail for the region. That does not include making sure that homeless people are cared for or escorted off of trains. That does not include, dramatically higher levels of enforcement. There are other agencies that are designed for this purpose that need to be funded, and we should be doing that. And forcing the MTA to do it is making them grasp at even more straws with the tiny budget that they're dealing with in this moment.
Isn't it amazing? Isn't it? Don't you find it amazing that there are agencies that have a mission to house the homeless, and they have created housing for the homeless, and the MTA's mission is to move people from one place to another, and they're a transit agency. Despite those two specialties, there are hundreds, if not probably thousands of people who would rather be, on the transit system than in the system that is actually designed for their needs.
Yeah, and I think what it speaks to is it speaks to our failures writ large to get at the root of some of our social problems. And it goes to, if there is any moment in time where we need to be examining this, it's this moment of the twin crises of the pandemic and the crisis around policing. Now is the time for us to take a step back and say, where as a city, where as a state, and as a country are we prioritizing how we spend our money? Should we put more money into social services? Should we put more money into transit? Should we put more money into these things so that they are attractive options for people, and then hire the folks who can help steer them in that direction? I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number of homeless people who just don't know what services are available to them because of lack of outreach, because of their own mental health issues. There's a wide range of things. We're not anywhere close to solving these things, and we're putting the pressure on the wrong people and the wrong institutions to do it.
Yeah, the only thing that I would press upon the MTA, and they could be doing this and I just might not know, but at the terminals, when there is a sudden spike in homelessness, making sure that those who are working at the terminals report that to the appropriate people and alert them, hey, we're seeing a sudden uptick in the amount of homelessness. That kind of communications, I know typically MTA people will not pay that close attention to, and I think that part of it, they could make sure that they're advising as quickly as possible, hey, we're seeing an uptick.
Yeah. Right, there were some operational changes, weren't there also, Bob? In other words, the homeless weren't on all of the lines. They were concentrated on certain lines where they were operated in such a way so that you could get a full night's sleep and not be bothered, right?
That's right, and then people were turning their back to what was actually happening and not reporting on it. I mean, many years ago, we had a huge problem between 2nd Avenue and Broadway Lafayette. We literally had to put up walls to prevent them from climbing between the tracks and sleeping there between the tracks. Now, I think it's incumbent on the MTA to make sure that they're communicating what's happening on the system to the appropriate authorities. I think that's certainly something that they could do.
Can we talk a little bit about the commuter lines? Because the MTA is not just the subways, it's also Metro North, right? It's also the Long Island Railroad. And have you given any thought, any view to, how those are going to have to change in this new era?
Yeah, I mean, the drop-off in ridership on LIR and Metro North was actually even more severe than on subways and buses. Their decline was somewhere in the range of 97%. There were just so many people who had the option to work from home who live out in the suburbs in comparison to the essential workers who were more concentrated in the city. The things that are going to need to happen on commuter rail are actually pretty similar to what needs to happen on the subways. Our recommendations from the report that we're putting out later this week are roughly the same across the system. But some key things I think that can happen that are a little bit different are, we need to really accelerate contactless and touchless ways of interacting with the system. And commuter rail is a great place to do that. There's more room and there's just more literal physical space to install more. For instance, Omni is the new system that we've all seen rolling out across subways. Rolling that out across LIRR to make sure that you don't have to touch anything when you're entering the system, I think is going to be one main point of benefit for folks. We're fortunate to already have some app-based ticketless options, but the thing that needs to happen here is we need to bring that all under one house. So, right now, yes, you can buy a Metro North ticket on your phone, but then you have to transfer onto the subway and you need a Metro card. So being able to streamline these systems across all operational platforms will do a lot to help make people's trips more seamless, more contactless, and easier. We also need to think about NJ Transit as well in this conversation. I'm on the governor's transition team for reopening in New Jersey, and NJ Transit's come up a lot. There's a huge influx of riders who come in every single day under the Hudson to get into the city. And if we start seeing more of those people converting to cars, well, we're going to have huge crushes on our tunnels and bridges, and that's going to be a real crisis for us again. So, one thing you could look at is the exact same sort of solutions we're talking about here for the MTA. They apply there, but there's nothing technologically that stops something like Omni from integrating all systems throughout the region. Imagine being able to get on a train in Patterson and take it all the way out to Long Island, having a one-stop ride, or if you've got a transfer, you're just able to use the same method of ticket.
Right, and that is coming with the next payment system, I understand,
Yes.
or at least the capability will be there, as will the capability through congestion pricing, where you could charge people more during the most crowded periods, and that would push some riders out to the least crowded periods. And Andy Byford, before he left, said, that's something that was going to be looked at, and I assume it will be. But to your point of one-seat rides, this gets to something that Bob has written about quite a bit over the years, would be to realign the way the trains move. Because right now, if you want to go from Long Island to New Jersey, you can go to Penn Station and then you have to stop and get off and get on another train. And Bob, can you just explain very briefly, what your idea is for making that, for changing that system?
Well, it basically is marrying the operations of the Long Island Railroad and New Jersey Transit. The reason we have so much congestion is because the trains terminate there. Penn Station is a station. A train can stop and continue on. It can still change train crews if New Jersey Transit and Long Island Railroad crews don't want to go. That's what happens here in Center City, Philadelphia. But to have the trains go from Trenton out to Babylon, or Huntington out to the Morris and Essex lines, would just make Penn Station so much more simpler to operate. And it really, in the long run, with Gateway, would be a wonderful thing to, instead of put money into Penn South, just build the tunnels under the Gateway and continue on to the East Side access and have trains from New Jersey hit Penn Station and Grand Central. In the long run, it could really help their operating budget if they could all operate by touching both stations, and it would reduce crowding for the subways if Long Islanders and New Jersey riders could all reach their destinations without having to transfer for the subway.
When you talk about Penn South, what you're referring to is the trains have to turn around. They need space underground to turn around. And what you're saying is just run them straight through.
If you ran them straight through, as Amtrak operates straight through, the platforms could be more predictable with the information systems that we have. We could have a lot less scurrying about in the caverns of Penn Station, and we could, especially in the afternoon rush hour, really clean that mess up. And we could really, even with just 21 tracks, we could have such a smoother operation without people climbing and crawling all over each other, trying to get to their track. And too often right now, New Jersey Transit waits way too long to tell passengers when the next train's departing to Trenton, and you see a huge rush. Now in this COVID era, I think it's a good time to kind of revisit that operation and say, is this what we really want? Is there a better way to do it? London is close to opening the Elizabeth Tunnel. Paris has had the RER system for many years. They have 3.5 million riders a day in Paris on their regional rail system. And that's not even the totality of their regional rail system. We're so far behind.
We're outliers, what you're saying, like other kind of transit networks around the world do this. And in Europe, they've spent many millions of dollars creating the system, and it has worked so far, where you can just get on a train and ride from one system to the next without.
And even if you wanted to do this piecemeal as a way to start this, to start better using commuter rail tomorrow, you could institute a fare rationalization within New York City, where you're saying, to get people off the subway at a time when Metro North and Long Island Railroad ridership is so low, where anybody who gets on in the city and is going to another city station will just pay a single, ideally $2.75 fare. We're running the trains, they're empty, they can take on more people without worrying about social distancing and without worrying about this crowding that we've talked about. They haven't even really done that. And that, the RER in Paris is the same fare as the metro if you're taking it within the city. And, it just helps to spread out the load. It helps to get people places faster.
The problem
The red line.
is a jurisdictional problem, it's that we have too many hands in the pot and nobody's able to really step back and say, all right, I'm going to turn over authority to one central agency to make that happen. And that's a core problem in New Jersey. It was a core problem in the Christie era. It remains a problem now. There's just not some kind of critical will to say, all right, let's integrate these systems and get it done. The other big problem that would have to be figured out is funding. New Jersey Transit is tremendously underfunded. It's been underfunded for decades. They have been transferring hundreds of millions of dollars every single year out of their capital budget just to cover operating shortfalls. And that's why you don't see any expansion on New Jersey Transit. So, I love the idea of integrating transit. I'm all for it. But one of the things we're going to have to solve is how do we fund the other half of the system on the other side of the Hudson that has been so dramatically underfunded?
And of course, one of the challenges is, we're going to have to wrap it up. And one of the challenges is that not only, you have so many bureaucracies, but the MTA itself has been a bunch of silos. Long Island Railroad, Metro North, New York City Transit, and the tunnels and bridges are each their own silos, and they have been like that for decades. And there's been talk about fixing it, and all those efforts really have not come to very much. But we are going to have to leave it there. I would like to thank all of our guests: Nick Sifuentes from the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, Bob Previdi formerly from New York City Transit, and Ben Kabak from Second Avenue Subways blog, my favorite transit blog. Thank you all for joining us. To our readers, please go to therealdeal.com and subscribe. It's not expensive, and you get all your top real estate news every day. We'll see you next time on TRD Talks Live. Thank you very much.